Welcome to the first in a series of webinars and podcasts discussing soil health, specifically in relation to the growing of potatoes. Soil health has a major impact on productivity and economic performance, and as part of our Great Soils Health campaign, headed up by Alice Sin and Amanda Bennett of the AHDB. The goal of this campaign is to encourage potato growers to reconsider their current practice when it comes to soil health. New ideas and ways of approaching the emerging new guidelines will have a huge impact on traditional management practices and ultimately the financial health of a business. Our first webinar will cover the impact of Environmental Land Management Scheme, ELMS for short. We have Dr. Jonathan Foote, Head of Environment and Resource Management, speaking about what potato growers will have to do to comply with this new legislation. We then move on to James Bramley, Farm Manager of MH Poskett in East Yorkshire. He joins me for a live Q&A session where we will cover off the challenges that have been faced lifting in wet conditions and the detrimental effects it can have on the soil structure. James will also prime our audience on the part he will play later in this series of podcasts and webinars in discussing the issues with renting land for potatoes and root crops. Then we have Harry Henderson, Knowledge Exchange Technical Manager AHDB, who introduces an alternative approach to productivity and improving the environmental impacts of potato growing in the 21st century. And as our last speaker on this session, we have Andy Whitmore from Rothamsted Research, who will be discussing his research piece on long-term benefits of including organic matter into the crop rotation. A particular topic he highlights is the challenges associated with long-term strategy to manage soil organic matter and short-term land rentals. Before I pass over to our first speaker, there are a few items of housekeeping I do need to run through. Firstly, all attendees will be on mute throughout the webinar. However, please send your questions in using the questions function on the right-hand side of your screen. We will try and cover a couple of questions after each presentation and then have a Q&A session at the end with all the speakers. If we happen to run out of time, we will get back to you with an answer via email. Basis and Enroso points are available, and if you put normal details required into the chat section, Christian will apply on your behalf, and I must mention that nobody else will see this information. There are also handouts available with this webinar, and they can be accessed via the webinar control panel. This webinar, as with all our webinars, will be recorded and can be seen again by visiting the AHDB events page and on the website. A link to the recording will be sent out after the webinar. For those of you on Twitter, tweet away using @AHDBpotatoes, #potatoes, #GreatSoils. And now over to our first speaker, who is going to be Jonathan Foote.
Hi there, thank you very much for that. I head up the environment team, which Alice and Amanda sit in, and they've helped sort of pull this content together. So thank you very much to them both. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm just going to run through very quickly what DEFRA's vision for ELMS is and how that will impact farmers, not just within the potato sector, but across the board. And explain some of the reasons why the government are moving in this particular direction. So if I start with why, the key thing is that as Brexit comes along and at the end of this year we move to a sort of new world where we're competing on international markets, we will then also come out of the Common Agricultural Policy, and that gives the UK government a massive opportunity, a once-in-a-generation opportunity really, to think about how we reward farmers for the sort of services and goods that they provide beyond just the food. And DEFRA really want to move away from sort of payment for sort of owning and managing sort of large chunks of land to sort of rewarding farmers and land managers for delivering public goods with public money. And that's very much about providing sort of clean air, clean water, and protecting the landscapes that we all so value. It's about ensuring that we can still continue to have a self-reliant and resilient farming sector, and that includes making sure that whatever is produced is highly sustainable and meets improving environmental standards. It's about providing farmers and land managers with a bit more certainty about where their income is going to come from, and a bit long-term sort of signaling in terms of how long you can depend on that money. And I think historically some of the sort of schemes that we've had have resulted in flip-flopping of policy and payments linked to that, and therefore it's made it difficult for farmers and land managers to sort of make investment. And again, we want to make sure that we maintain world-class animal welfare standards, world-class environmental standards, and we don't have a race to the bottom, as we've maybe seen in other sectors where change has occurred. And yesterday we saw the government's 10-point plan being published, but prior to that, can I have the next slide, please? We also had the government's 25-year plan, which seeks to leave the environment in a better condition for future generations than it is currently now. Yesterday's plan really just reinforced what was in this particular document with plans to plant trees and greater protection for areas of outstanding natural beauty, national parks, etc. But within that document, there is a reference and commitment towards the Environmental Land Management Scheme, or ELMS. As I've said, it's very much focused on delivering public goods and therefore rewarding farmers and land managers for delivering those public goods. And as I mentioned just now, it is about clean water and plentiful water. It's about clean air, protection from environmental hazards. So that's really talking about flood mitigation, and may involve projects to almost put mini dams, etc., into streams upstream to reduce flooding in urban areas downstream from that particular catchment. It could be to protect peatlands, which has benefits in terms of reducing climate change impacts, but also acts as a big sponge for heavy rainfall events in the uplands. It's about protecting plants and wildlife, and generally protecting the sort of unique landscapes that we have in many parts of the country that have evolved and co-evolved with agricultural systems. So it's about making sure that we can provide that, and the government believes that the public wants to see those sort of levels of protection. Next slide, please. So how's the scheme designed? Well, we're still waiting for final detail, but what we have seen at the moment is that there are sort of 3 tiers proposed. Tier 1 is really focused on farm. It's about having a pick and mix approach to a range of options. So if you're farming potatoes, it may be that you have a nutrient management plan, and you look at your pest management, pesticide use in conjunction, and think about, well, what can I do to encourage beneficial insects that will manage the pests on the farm, and how can I improve the soil that I've got on the farm in terms of soil health, maybe soil carbon. What it won't do on any of these tiers is potentially pay for, carbon offsetting, and whilst there may be some activities that you undertake in terms of habitat management, it's unlikely to pay for that sort of carbon offsets, especially within the soil, because it's a temporary store of carbon, and in effect you can knock that carbon out of the soil through management activities like harvesting your potatoes, ploughing, etc., within a year. So they're looking to lock up long-term carbon stores within the environment, but you still would get paid to have managed carbon because it provides other benefits in terms of reducing nutrient loss, giving the soils greater resilience against climate change, supporting the crop, improving crop health. So the money will be there, but not necessarily for the sort of offsetting side of things. Tier 2 is very much about on-farm, but maybe with more work with others in the landscape, community groups, but maybe neighbouring farmers, involving tree planting, flood management schemes, managing footpaths and so forth. And then the sort of really big sort of one, which will require collaboration within a particular area amongst various land managers and landowners, is looking at transforming the land use, and that might be that we've got planting of forests and woodland creation, massive amounts of peatland restoration and protect what peat we've got. Maybe it's putting habitats back, such as heathlands, etc. So that, you know, they're quite significant changes in land use, and in many cases will potentially change the way in which farming would work. Now, in terms of potato farming and other arable systems, there may not be many examples of tier 3 sort of ELMS agreements, and it will sit mainly in tiers 1 and 2, where you've got greater ability to, you know, do the pick and mix approach, but also then think about in areas maybe of the land which is slightly less productive, to sort of do a bit of habitat restoration or creation that then provides an income stream. Next slide, please. So the agriculture bill has been published, and it sets the 7-year transition period, and we will start to see from February next year a call for farmers to be able to put in bids for ELMS as part of the pilot. So a pilot process will operate for the first few years, and that will enable DEFRA and the other partners to sort of hammer out any sort of issues. The idea, I believe, and this is not firmed up yet, is that then they would review the submission over the summer with a view to then sort of kicking off ELMS payments and awarding pilot projects in the autumn next year. Applications for the simplified countryside scheme are currently open, but you know, those will start to close out, and as people start to move to the new ELMS processes, you know, those historical agreements will be phased out. But the DEFRA say nobody will be disadvantaged unfairly during the transition phase. The last countryside stewards scheme agreements will start in 2024, and direct payments will be phased out from January 2021 through to 2027. So whilst some of these dates sound a long way out, actually they will come round all too soon for many of us. More information can be found if you go to gov.uk and you search for farming changes to farming in England, and of course there will be differences in England, in Wales and Scotland as well, where there'll be local sort of variations of schemes. I think the main thing to bear in mind as well is that if you're growing potatoes, it's important that you think about doing some due diligence and understand what the ELMS requirements of that land are. So if you're renting land to grow potatoes, then you need to really speak to the landowner to make sure what they've got in place in terms of ELMS agreements and what, you know, could end up resulting in them losing that. Because if you know, there are repeated failures on land, then it may be that you find that in future years the growing of potatoes would be less welcome. Now, I know that most people are pretty cautious and pretty careful about how they sort of take on rented land and how they manage that and reduce the impacts on the soil and the surrounding sort of environment. But I think it's worth thinking about, you know, that due diligence and recording that conversation so that you've got a position to fall back on at the end of the crop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That was really insightful. Now we're actually going to go and join Mr. James Bramley, moving on to our next speaker. James comes from MH Poskett, who has kindly agreed to join us to discuss his initial thoughts on the challenges of harvesting in wet conditions and the difficulty in obtaining rented land for the growing of potatoes. So, James, if you could give everybody an introduction to yourself, for your role and your background and experience in growing potatoes.
Hello, I'm James Bramley. I'm the veg manager at MH Poskett, and my duties entail the looking after and growing of potatoes, the carrots, the parsnips, the swede and the pumpkins. I deal with the landlords, the customers, and work closely with the agronomists. And my experience with potatoes, my father used to be a farmer and used to grow potatoes, so from a very early age I've been susceptible to them.
We know that the last 2 years have been very challenging, specifically in lifting of potatoes in wet conditions. In your view, how has this affected the crop and, more importantly, the soil for the following crop?
Indeed, the other year was very challenging, very wet conditions. It affected the quality of the potatoes. We had several fields that we couldn't lift in time, which affected the quality and didn't meet our customers' requirements. So obviously it was a financial loss to us. And it was a financial loss not just to ourselves, but to the landlords who wanted to follow the potatoes with the winter wheat crop. As we know, it was very damaging to the soil profile, and it will take several years to correct. It can also then obviously bring on issues for whether the landlord will invite you back for the following year. And it is something that we do pride ourselves on, that we do build relationships and connections with them.
Is there anything you can currently implement as a grower to support the soil structure after the lifting of a potato crop?
It's something that with the soil, we want it in as good a conditions as possible before we take it on. So it wants to be, good organic matter level in it. And also management at the time of lifting is very important. We're fortunate enough to have a self-propelled harvester, so the more challenging areas and tram lines, we can send that machine to work on its own to clear the land, so you're not having to send trailers down and run over the field and have more of a sort of a detailed approach to it. So that's sort of what we implement at the moment.
Super. From a grower's perspective, what practices do you currently employ to encourage improving the soil structure, for example, application of FYM, or even adding a cover crop into the rotation?
We do currently apply FYM where we can rotationally, and again to get the soil in as good a conditions as possible before the crop goes in. And we have started using cover crops, and as a business we need to work more closely with those for sure. And at the moment we have started working with a simple mix of a black oat and Phacelia mix.
So how much rented land do you acquire to put into potatoes a year?
It does vary, but approximately 80 hectares. And
Okay.
that's on a short-term rotation to a longer sort of, ongoing agreement.
Okay, and so from a grower's perspective, what do you feel is the current situation in relation to the quality of land offered by other growers for the growing of potatoes and root veg?
The pressure is increasing. There's more and more people needing a wider pool, land pool, and we're constantly looking for the process of building trust and relationship, and for farmers to actually take the partnership on with us, as far as we will respect the land as well as what they will. I think changing times are ahead in agriculture, which could also open up more opportunities.
So what husbandry practices do you take into consideration in terms of the actual soil quality when you look at renting land?
So rotation, obviously, we want to add a rotation as possible. You look at the soil, you can never beat the walk across the field with a spade to have a look at what soil conditions you are playing with. And it's something that when you do take the land, you have to accept the rough with the smooth. So after the 20 hectare field, if you've got half a hectare on the brow of the hill, you don't plant it, you don't disturb the soil. You've got to sort of respect it, I feel. So we're also starting to carry out the broad spectrum soil analysis this year, and sort of be more measured approach specifically to each field.
Thank you, James. That's really insightful. And finally, our last question. What is your attitude to the future in terms of acquiring land? And would you be prepared to pay a premium for land that had a residual fertility value?
I've repeated myself several times, partnership. It's something longevity-wise. The trust has got to be there that we will do the best, as if it was our own land, as we do as on our own. And as far as the value, yes, each field is and can be taken and valued on its own merits.
Okay, well, thank you very much, James. James will also be appearing on a podcast in early January 2021, discussing the importance of the length of rotations and when it comes to growing potatoes and other root crops. So now we move on to our next speaker, which is Harry Henderson, who will be speaking about regenerative agriculture.
Thank you very much, Antonia. Thanks for inviting me. Christian, can we have the next slide? And I think that that's a poll. So what we wanted to do here was to quickly dive into a poll. Potatoes and soil, what's your most important objective here? Is it to simplify seedbed and planting operations, manage costs, be on the preferred list when renting land, which James and Antonia discussed just a few minutes ago, or look beyond the hamster wheel of inputs? So applying one fertilizer will mean more herbicide or more fungicide. Which one of those would you go for the most? I'm quite aware that I could have put the option of all of the above, but I think it would be just interesting to see what people put as their priority. So we'll just give that a few more seconds. And yeah. Once we're there, Christian?
I was going to leave it. Yeah, I'll leave it another 5-10 seconds. I think it's just starting to pick up in votes. Obviously, okay. Quite long answers and stuff. Just to vote, you want to click on the screen on your correct answer on the little circle. That should do it. But I think it's starting to tail off now, so I'll close it now.
Okay, so a bit of a spread. What have we got? 24% simplifying seedbed operations, 32% manage costs, be on the preferred list when renting land, 16%, and 28% look beyond the hamster wheel of inputs. So I guess the two top ones and perhaps two more popular ones are linked, but it's interesting to know that. That's very good. Thank you. We have the next slide, please, Christian, and the next one on again. So I thought I won't hang on. I won't go back. So we thought we'd just talk about this final report from 5 years ago, and it takes into account a lot of this type of information. I don't think I'm going to read all of that text, but reducing your level of your depth when destoning isn't detrimental to yield or quality, but can produce you quite a lot of benefits in terms of cost and fuel and time and effort. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So I just picked this chart out of that report, and it was the effect of fuel consumption in destoning depth. And you can see shallow at 25 centimeters, commercial 37, and deep at 45 at the bottom there. And you can see the work rates dramatically drop from 0.37 of a hectare per hour to 0.14 of a hectare per hour. Fuel similarly, and fuel and labour, you can see then just under £1 per tonne when it comes through to cost of production for the shallow, and £2.52 per tonne. So you can see there's quite an impact there simply by the depth of destoning, and that report goes into an awful lot of other details as well. I've just picked one snippet of information out of it. We have the next slide, please. So there's a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture, and usually it's the preserve of the cereal farmer that can shove everything up the front of a combine, and the poor root crop guys are usually forgotten and left out in the cold. And so, hang on, what can we do this a little bit differently? Can we talk about regenerative potatoes? Is it no-till potatoes? Not necessarily. Would you want to eliminate fertilizer use within potatoes? Is that even possible? Is it just a pie in the sky thing? Could you reinvest in the soil? Well, James Bromley's already talked about that, and certainly yes, you can do more in that. Use cover crops to conserve moisture in the heat of the day in the midsummer. Integrate livestock. Drastically cut cost of production without a reduction in yield. And in terms of regenerative potatoes, it's an all or nothing thing. You want to get into all of it, or there's little that you can leave behind. The reason I say these things is that we've got a very interesting speaker coming up, Brendan Rocky, on the 24th of November at the Potato Industry Conference. I heard him speak back in January at the No-Till conference, and he felt a little bit out of place going to a No-Till conference to talk about potatoes, but he won the crowd over. He's not sure that no-till potatoes would really work, but all of these other things he's absolutely dead set on, and he will explain to you how this sort of thing is going to work. So is it something that we could look at in the UK? Definitely. All of these things, or some of these things, certainly. So it's an interesting time, really, and I think potatoes shouldn't get left behind in this sort of different thinking. Can we have the next slide, please? It's one of the key points he was making was almost the farming and the creation of habitat for beneficial insects that will control a large proportion of your aphids within a potato crop. And he's very keen on providing habitat, providing the food source, and then integrating that into a potato crop, so ladybirds can come along and to control aphids. He's well aware it won't control all aphids, and then to counter that, he wants to keep the aphids clean so they're not transmitting viruses and disease between them and the potato plant. We'll have the next slide, please. It has to be said, there is a potato crop in there, and this is with companion cropping. There's legumes in there, there's flowers in there to support the beneficial insects, and it's not going to look very tidy. All of us like looking across, but clean as a whistle potato rows when we're driving down the road. A regen ag potato crop isn't going to look that tidy, but this is the sort of thing that these guys are getting into. As I say, a legume for fixing nitrogen and providing extra material to plough in once the potato crop is gone. None of this interferes with the harvesting operation, so they're crops that can be controlled before harvesting and provide the value whilst in the crop. Next slide, please, Christian. This is a slide that Brendan Rocky produced, and he's thinking everything in red is things that he would add to the potato crop to protect it, but then he felt that it also had an antagonistic effect on everything else, and he got onto this hamster wheel. This is where this phrase hamster wheel of inputs comes from, that he adds fungicide that has a detrimental effect on the soil, the life in the soil structure. He gets into a lot of tillage, and that has a detrimental effect on carbon. It reduces the water availability. You have to put more herbicides on, and so on. And the same with insecticides. Then insecticides would harm the beneficial insects, and they won't control the aphids. So he got into this mindset that this is all too much. And so if we have the next slide, please, Christian. So he's gone into, and you'll see at the bottom, biotic inputs. So he does use biotic inputs through his sprayer as well as companion planting, but he wanted every aspect of the potato crop to be able to support each other. So you've got carbon in the soil, you've got life in the soil, there's life on the plant, the beneficial insects are helping, and all of that is helping to suppress weeds as well. He weeds within the potato crop. He weeds before planting and goes in for shallow planting as well. And all of this is with an irrigated system as well. We can have the last slide, I think. So another poll then, Christian, if you can. So if the UK would take an interest in regenerative potatoes, what information would you like to see the most? And I've deliberately left out all of the above, but would you want to reduce fertilizer inputs, better information on weed control without actually using herbicides, how it improves the soil care, how blight could be controlled, and how or if yield and quality is affected. Can it do these things? Do you think it's not likely? Do you think it's got some legs? What do you think would be the what aspect of those choices would you like to see the most of from us if we were able to put something together? Give it a few more seconds.
Yep, just 5-10 seconds, then I'll close it. I think it's starting to.
And you can see why really we wouldn't have put all of the above, because we wanted to tease out what people want. So that's interesting, isn't it? So 7% reduced fertilizer inputs, same 7% on weed control, how it improves soil care at 21%, how blight is affected 11%, but 54% is how yield and quality is affected. And I guess that shows, does it show the amount of skepticism in this, where yield and quality is king? If you haven't got the yield and you haven't got the quality, you're not going to make a lot of money, and that could be the key point here. But it's important to get those thoughts across. So I think that's it from me. Yes, it is. So thanks for that. That's just a taster, I've got to say. Dial into Brendan Rocky. He'll put it across much better than me. He's just an average Joe farmer, and you'll hear that he's very sensible, very level, very balanced. He's doing it for money. He's doing it for a profit. And he's a really interesting guy to hear speak. And I'm very pleased that he's agreed to speak to us at the Potato Conference.
Thank you very much, Harry. I have to admit, I'm really quite looking forward to it, actually, to be fair. He was quite a find, I think, actually. And so now, as to our last speaker on this session, we now have Andy Whitmore from Rothamsted Research, who will be discussing his research piece on long-term benefits of including organic matter into the crop rotation. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Antonia, and thank you to HDB for inviting me to talk today. So next slide, please. If I could have the next slide, Christian. Thank you. So I work at Rothamsted, which, as many of you probably know, is an arable agricultural research station in the east of England. I've got a photograph there of our founder, reassuringly bearded, from the 18th century. From the 1800s, and he made his money from inventing phosphate fertilizer, and set up Rothamsted and Research in the 1840s. But of course, this has given rise to this misconception, as you don't want to go and ask anybody at Rothamsted a question, because they'll tell you to come back in 100 years. But I want to give you, I want to lay that lie to rest today by showing some research that has more immediate benefits on organic matter. If you could give me the next slide, please, Christian. And what I really just want to give a plan of the talk, that how much does organic matter help over the long term? Let's say medium term, over the length of a rotation, perhaps. How can we decide how much to organic matter to add, and for how long? How long does it last? How long do its benefits last? And then I'm going to leave with a question, which I'm very glad to have heard James speak earlier. What kind of strategies can we have for managing the long-term levels of organic matter in soil, and how can this be reconciled with short-term rentals? So if I could have the next slide, please. And you might need to click it twice, because I've got a graph that comes up. What we've got, oh, sorry, that this, yeah, sorry, my mistake. If you go back one, I've got a field there that
I think there's a bit of a delay, Andy, with passing the slides, just but yeah, all good.
Yeah. So if we can go back to the picture, there we go. This is our farm buildings there in the middle, and then underneath it, as it were, is the Broadbrook field, or you may have heard about this, which is a field we've been growing wheat on almost every year since 1843. And there's a bit of a checkerboard effect there, and that's different treatments, different rotations, different levels of nitrogen or phosphorus, or indeed organic matter that go on there. But if you look to the right of the farm, This field is Hoosfield, which is much less well known, but basically it does the same thing for spring barley that Rothamsted does for wheat. And if you could let me have the next slide, please. I'm going to show you some results from this spring barley field, and in particular, the organic matter that's applied. So on the top left there, if you click it one more time, please, Christian, we should get a series of response curves that come up. That's a response of the barley yields on the vertical axis to the nitrogen applied on the horizontal axis. And if you look first at the blue line, these are some results from plots which received only fertilizer, nitrogen, only bag N. And if you look at it and imagine it continuing over to the right, however much more fertilizer you put on, it's really not going to go up very much. There are two other response curves there on the diagram, and I hope you will agree that that blue line, where only bag N is being given, never really scales the same heights as the other two treatments. Now, those other two treatments, as indicated, also receive fertilizer, also get bag N, but in addition, they've been given farmyard manure. Now, the top line is a treatment that started in 1853, along with the rest of this experiment. That's getting farmyard manure every year, or almost every year, since that time. And that's yielding substantially more than the plot that only gets mineral nitrogen. And we're putting that down, I think, to improvements in soil structure that the organic matter brings about. If you look at that blue line, however much more nitrogen you apply, it never gets up to the green line. So I don't think that the additional yield that we're seeing there comes from the nitrogen that the manure contains. It comes from something else, possibly improving the structure, allowing the roots to find water and other nutrients, possibly improving the drainage. But one of the interesting things here then to look at is this red line. This was a treatment that started in the year 2000, and the set of curves that I'm showing as a whole are the average responses over the first 10 years or so of the trial. And what you can see then, or I hope you'll agree, is that red line is nearly as good as its old cousin from 1853, the green line. So you're getting nearly all the benefits of applying that organic matter in 10 years or so. And actually, it's even better than that. If you could press it one more time, please, Christian. If you imagine where these curves level off, say the blue line, it probably doesn't get any higher than about 5 tons per hectare if you're lucky. And the green and the red line, if you carry those over until they're flattening off, you reckon you're up to about 7 tons per hectare. That's the maximum of each of those curves. And that's what I've plotted out in the panel down to the bottom right, which has just appeared. I've plotted out those maximum yields that were achieved on the experiment in every year, the first 10 years since 2000, when that red new treatment started. You can see the maximum yields obtained in the bag N only, the mineral nitrogen only, the blue curve at the bottom. But if you look at the red and green lines, that red line is rapidly approaching the yields that you obtain from the long-term farmyard manure plus mineral N treatment, and it really gets there in 2 or 3 years. So the take-home message from this particular series of results is, yes, adding organic matter can help improve yields quite substantially if you're lucky, but it also can achieve that really quite rapidly over a 2, 3, 4 year time frame, perhaps as long as over a rotation, in other words. But then there is also the question, of course, what happens if you stop applying organic matter? How long does its effect last? So I'm going to turn to another series of experiments, if I could have the next slide, please, which deal with this particular issue. And sorry, I'm getting myself out of sync again. This slide shows that most of the benefits that you can get are with potatoes. So unfortunately, we don't grow potatoes at Rothamsted. I had a European colleague come work with me for a while, and she had some results from a number of trials that have been run through Northwest Europe. And she looked at the percentage effect of organic matter on different crops, depending on whether they'd received manure or some other kind of organic amendment. And she found the greatest effect was found in potatoes. Unfortunately, she wasn't quite as positive about barley or as wheat as we are, but we put that down to the different growing conditions in the countries where she was looking at. So yes, there's a benefit of organic matter, and quite optimistically for this particular meeting, it looks as though most benefit is achieved for potatoes. And now if we could go on to the next slide, I think I've got an aerial photograph again of the field where we carried out some trials to look at how long the benefits of organic matter persist in soils once you stop applying it. And this is at our sister site up at Woburn, just up the M1 from Rothamsted. So if I could have the next slide, please. This experiment has run since 1966, but it's gone through a number of different phases. There have been a number of different treatments, and in particular, what I want to show here are some results from the 1980s, where organic matter levels in soil were built up over 5 or 6 years at the beginning of the decade, and then a series of wheat crops were grown in the ground between 1986 and 1987 and 1995. And same color coding here as before, and the same idea. I've got response curves for winter wheat this time, plotted out on the vertical axis against the amount of nitrogen which is applied as fertilizer going along the horizontal axis. Blue only receives mineral N fertilizer out of a bag, and the red line receives that, but it is also grown in the plots where organic matter was applied prior to the start of this particular phase of the experiment. So we've built up organic matter levels and now we're letting them decline. And as you can see in the first 3 panels, 87 to 91, that benefit of the organic matter has all but disappeared. By 92, it's gone. And then in the bottom right slide, what I've plotted out is a measure of this extra yield. That's kind of a difference between the heights of those 2 lines, if you like, and how that declines over a period of about 5 or 6 years. So I'm saying we can build that organic matter up in 2, 3, 4 years or so. Once you've got it in soil, it will probably last for 5, 6, 7 years if you're lucky, depending on how much you add and what level you get to and so forth. So if you could let me have the next slide, please. Here I've got on the left-hand side a sort of representation. I took 2 experiments there that I've described results from, but they don't really go together because one's barley, one's wheat, they're on different fields, different amounts of organic matter and even kinds of organic matter applied. So I've just sketched out the general scheme of what I'm saying takes place. If you look at that red line, we've got a build-up time over a few years when I'm imagining that organic matter has been applied, and with every application of organic matter, you get some additional yield. Stop applying organic matter and that organic matter will decay away in soil, and so will the additional yield. But it's important to remember during this declining phase, that's still a benefit. That's still more yield than you would get with only applying fertilizer alone. There is a residual value to that organic matter. But then I'm asking a question now of what happens when land is rented, because I've made a strong case for putting organic matter on for a few years, but would all the farmers in a series of rental contracts do that? And in particular, if the potato grower is most likely to be benefit, would a wheat farmer or a barley farmer or someone else who's managing the rotation be prepared to keep up with the organic matter inputs, or indeed put organic matter in at all, if they feel they have to pay for it or there's a cost, if they aren't seeing all that benefit? So there are direct benefits perhaps from applying on organic matter, but there is also a residual value after you've applied it. And I'm asking questions really about how we take account of that residual value and how we can help one another. And James put it very well, that it's a partnership within the rotation. And of course, cereal growers need a break crop. They're fighting with blackgrass a lot of the time, so other crops in a rotation like potatoes ought to help with that. So if I can have the last slide, please, I'll just summarize that organic matter can increase yields. In a sense, that's fertility, however it does it, with other nutrients that it contains, or improving the drainage, improving the water holding capacity. And rotations too have been shown to improve fertility. That's why we have rotations. But the question is, how do we get the benefit of rotations and of improving soil organic matter in a rental situation? Who benefits? Is it the landlord or the grower? And then which grower? And then are there incentives for a grower to improve land if someone else is going to benefit? And with that, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Andy. And that basically draws our lineup of speakers for this webinar to a close. So if we'd like to open the floor for some questions, we have some questions that are coming in now. So could I have my speakers back, please? Right. Okay. I've got a number of questions that have come through here. And I'm going to start with a question from Tom Kirby. And he's basically asking, with potatoes being particularly harmful to organic matter, how are you managing organic matter inputs? You mentioned different years, but one cover crop being used. I don't know who would want to be able to answer this. This came in, I think, during Harry's presentation. Anybody?
I think I'll tackle it.
Thank you.
If anyone else wants to come in, but I think it was just less cultivations, less intensive cultivations at planting, and then producing either putting a companion crop rather than a cover crop in with the potatoes to improve nutrient uptake and soil stability.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to a question from Richard Danat, actually. Hello, Richard. He asks, are cover crops going to give us more, hang on a moment, are cover crops going to give us more problems with pests and diseases in a potato crop? Cover cropping again, who would like to answer this one?
I think I'll take that one, Antonia. I think it's something, there's a lot more to understand on cover crops. There's been a lot of work done on cover crops, but then if you break it down to layman terms, how much do we actually understand? It is a very good point that you have to be aware of what cover crop you're going to put into how it can affect the cropping in that rotation. So it's a good point.
Lovely, thank you. Now I've got a question for Andy here. This comes from Christopher Papworth. He says, can we assume that chopping straw and returning to the soil has the same effect as FYM? And he also asks, is compost as effective as FYM at building organic matter?
So the straw question, well, I take them both together in a sense that I think if you add in organic matter, generally that is going to have similar benefits to what I have shown. The tricky thing is with straw, which is that it's a very nitrogen deficient material. So something like farmyard manure and to some extent compost supply nitrogen too. But the straw is quite deficient in nitrogen, and it may well lock up some of the fertilizer end that's applied and appear therefore to compete with the crop for the N. So some of the trials we've carried out have compared farmyard manure, compost, anaerobic digestate and straw as materials to amend soil with. And in the end, the straw was achieving as great an increase in yield as the other materials, but you needed to put more nitrogen on in order to achieve that. So the other materials were saving you some nitrogen probably because certainly farmyard manure has got a fairly large amount of available N in it, but the straw was actually costing you more. But nonetheless, you could get more yield as a result of this yield increase I'm describing, as you would from the other materials. And just to delve into the compost a bit more, clearly all these materials can be a bit variable, and it depends how much dry matter you're getting, and it depends on the processes that have gone on. Generally, farmyard manure, if it's as you acquire it, probably has straw in it, so it's probably going to give you about the same amount, or compost is probably going to have about the same availability of nitrogen. But I would recommend you get an analysis done if you really want to be confident about what you're putting on your land. There are published tables, and AHDB have some sort of guidelines to what would be in materials that you could apply.
Lovely. I've got another one for you, Andy, whilst I have you, actually, if that's all right.
Quick drink of water then.
Yeah, that comes in from Jo Oban, and she basically asks, would cover crops help organic matter in the absence of FYM?
Yes, I'm part of a rotations project which has been run by NIAB, funded by AHDB. And indeed, I'm a little embarrassed to say that the results on that, by and large, show that cover crops are slightly better than organic matter or slightly more reliable. But again, there's a lot of variability. It depends. And in general, you wouldn't expect to get as much organic matter from cover crops because you're going to grow them over winter. You're going to get, I don't know, a couple of tons of dry matter or something like that. And that's not going to contain as much carbon as you might get from putting 20 tons or so of compost on. But so it varies. But yes, cover crop can be a good way of helping yields to improve and getting carbon into soil.
Lovely. Well, I think I'm actually going to close the questions now, and just a great thank you to everybody who's actually attended today on that. And there's been some very positive comments, and particularly from Mr. Andrew Wilson. Hi. So anyway, it leaves me now basically to bring this webinar to a close. And so may I say a big thank you to all our presenters today, and thank you all for attending. You will receive a survey immediately afterwards, so please take the time to fill it in, and we always want to hear your thoughts. The recording will be available shortly afterwards, and if you have any questions, you can contact me, and my details are on the website as well. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and there's just time to tell you about some more events that are coming up. From AHDB Potatoes, we have, of course, the 24th of November, we have the Potato Industry Conference. On the 25th of November, we have the AHDB Aphids Day. And then on the 30th of November to the 4th of December, we have two parallel events. And this basically takes the place of our usual agronomist day that we would have. So we've actually got Agronomy Week now, which is an online event. And we've also got Agronomist Induction. And they are basically running for that whole week in a series of webinars. So in early 2021, as a continuing program of the theme of soil and part of the Great Soils program, the Potato Soil Health series, we have scheduled in January 2021 a podcast where James Bramley will be with us again, and he will discuss the importance and the length of rotations when growing potatoes and other root crops. And then on Wednesday the 20th of January, we'll be having our second webinar, followed by our final webinar on Wednesday the 17th of February. I hope you can come along to all of these, and don't forget you can catch up via the events page on the AHDB website. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much for listening today. Stay safe from all of us at AHDB Potatoes. We very much look forward to seeing you all again in the future in person, eventually, instead of virtually. Thank you very much, and goodbye.